Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelou, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are this evening going to be discussing probably one of the best known of all the finance-related films, The Wolf of Wall Street. Lots to talk about, lots to discuss, a very, very entertaining and engaging film, but perhaps more importantly than either of those two, it's also very thought-provoking, particularly in relation to whether any or some or perhaps even most of the characteristics and drivers that the film showcases are still with us today in 2021. Let's see what everybody thinks about that. We're going to cover off some introductions. I'm going to go in the order of JB, then Hate, then Jenny, then Nigel, then Gareth, just so you know the order. JB is not on camera tonight, but JB, please take an opportunity to introduce yourself, tell us all where you are, and in general terms, why this film has been of interest to you, and then we'll go on to Hate. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andy, and good evening to everybody. My name is JB Beckett. I was an investment gatekeeper for the best part of 20 or so years. I have continued to be a non-exec director and I guess a advocate for better governance. Yeah, I watched this film when it came to the movies, Andy. It unsurprisingly kind of grabs the headlines, and it's obviously a very entertaining romp, but there's obviously a moral in the tale. And I actually went to watch Jason Jordan Belfort live.
Really?
He presented in Glasgow on hard selling techniques, which was incredibly eye-opening. And so for me, the whole idea of the boiler room kind of is the crux of sort of what's really wrong with finance and asset management generally. It's an extreme example in terms of Stratton. And so obviously I have a deep interest, and nice to be here.
JB, that's fascinating. So let me get this right. So Jordan was actually running was it like a serious seminar on hard selling techniques, or was it like a parody of himself? Which end of the lens was he looking at? Was he doing it seriously, or was it like a parody for himself?
It was sort of a sort of post-prison catharsis as to how he became incredibly successful,
right,
and being a hard salesperson, and the techniques that he employed in terms of penny stocks whilst he developed the Stratton business. And it was at the SECC, a large exhibition that's actually pretty much where COP26 is right now. So put that in context. And it was jam-packed with young salespeople, not finance, not asset management people. There was myself and a colleague. We went out there, frankly, through morbid curiosity. But actually, it was full of young, hungry salespeople who wanted to learn how to be the wolf, and I thought that was fascinating. Yeah.
Well,
the twist in the tale was he then hard sold them an upsell to
them.
then join him at a special retreat to then basically learn the darkest, deepest secrets. Being picked up, private jet, being picked up in a Bentley, taken off to, and of course, all for the paltry sum of about £10,000 each. It was fascinating to watch the dark master at work.
And seeing those people respond in a kind of lapping it up way from what you're describing. So it was still working. That's fascinating. And just roughly time standards for us, JB, how long ago was that?
So that would have been about 3 years ago.
Oh, my goodness me.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
He's globally touring that event. So he's going around the whole world creating little wolves and wolfesses to take on the next generation of hard selling.
Wow, that has really added a whole dimension to this conversation. I was not expecting that. JB, that's absolutely fascinating. I can see that Gareth is making some notes here. I'm sure we'll be coming back to some of those points a little bit later on. That's very, very interesting, JB. What a great place to start. Let's go to Dr. Kwai. Dr. Kwai, please take yourself off mute and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Tae Choi, living in Amersham, Buckinghamshire. I'm a retired NHSGB principal who is very interested in this financial matters, Financial Services Authority, especially FCA.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm starting to learn everything from you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Kwai. And
thank you.
Dr. Kwai, like many other members within our community, has had a direct hit on his own affairs in terms of finances by malpractice in the industry. I'm sure you can understand where I'm going with that. Let's go now to Nigel Cairns. Nigel, to you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm calling in from Devon. I'm a victim of bank malfeasance. I have a continuing dispute going on with my bank that's now in its 13th year. And I'm very obviously familiar with aspects of bank behaviour, very bad bank behaviour that have impacted on my case. But since my involvement with TTF, I've become much more cognizant of wider techniques and themes that are in common currency with financial institutions and banks. And clearly the Wolf of Wall Street, which is a very, very well-known film now, exemplifies, perhaps some of the very worst in human behaviour that's developed, from the riches to be had from bad behaviour. And it's even more shocking to hear from JB what he's just said a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
I was going to say earlier on that films like The Wolf of Wall Street have, to a certain extent, normalised the occurrence of this type of behaviour in society, perhaps to an extent where it has had an appeal to a certain number of younger people which wish to fill their pockets without the moral baggage that to take along the journey with them, perhaps.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Again, I'm sure this is a theme that Gareth will be picking up on. So there I was thinking the film is like almost like a public service statement of how not to behave and what's wrong in the financial sector. But clearly for some people, it's a big green light flashing, come here and you'll make a lot of money if you learn to do what I did. And perhaps the complete absence of thought around the moral side of it. That really is quite fascinating, what Jabe was saying earlier. Nigel, I dig what you say, sir. Thank you. Gareth is our volunteer head of film club for the TTF. He does this job supremely well. Gareth, please take a chance to introduce yourself, explain how you've ended up becoming our head of film club, and then share your initial thoughts about this particular movie. Thanks, Gareth.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I'll share my slides in a minute, but a bit about myself. My day job is as a pensions technical consultant. In a nutshell, we explain to pension professionals, or we help them solve issues to do with pensions law and regulation, to put it very simply. But how I came across the TTF was I was interested in the great stuff it was doing for victims of pension scams. Obviously a big blight on my particular industry. So that's how I came across the TTF, but then I found out about this film club. Film was an early love of mine. That was actually my degree. I did film studies at university. And on finding this out, Andy thought, well, you make a great candidate as the head of this particular film club. So that's what I've been doing ever since. And to a large degree, the extent of that is just coming up with some slides just to kick off the meeting every week. So without further ado, I will try and share some PowerPoint. To begin with, yeah, there we go. This is the film we're talking about. A great image of it, I think. Absolute pandemonium in the background, a very cocky gentleman in the foreground. Just a brief explainer. I get the impression everyone's seen the film, but directed by Martin Scorsese, of course, a highly acclaimed director. 7 years old now, which it doesn't feel like. It feels like it was just yesterday, but there we go. That's time for you. And brief synopsis. So this is the real life story, of course, of Jordan Belfort, perhaps with some artistic license taken. Perhaps there's some artistic license in his own memoir. We don't know. But anyway, it's based on his memoir. He recounts his career as a stockbroker, and in particular, the firm he created, Stratton Oakmont, and the rampant corruption and just depravity that seemed to go on at that company. Ultimately, the gentleman on the right, an FBI agent, eventually got to him, took him down, and he spent some time in jail, though not the nastiest run in America by the looks of it. So I went down a bit of a rabbit hole on IMDb and spent like the best part of an hour reading interesting facts and trivia about the film. These were the ones I thought were perhaps the most interesting or apropos. That quote, by the way, is quite like from the film. That's Jordan Belfort himself. I want you to deal with your problems or becoming rich. So, as I say, there's a real Jordan Belfort, and he was comfortable with the film's depiction of excess. But the only objection was that he said Stratton Ogmont did actually do, for the most part, serious work. So probably he'd say that Monday to Friday, Monday to Thursday lunchtime, hardworking people, very motivated, mostly doing legitimate business. And then, of course, what you see in the film is, the real excessive, but that's not the day to day. This was the extremes, the exceptions to the rule. Mark Hanna was the character portrayed by Matthew McConaughey very well. I thought very interesting character at the start of the film. This wasn't depicted, but he also invested into Jordan Belfort's business and eventually went to prison himself for securities fraud. Considering his little speech at the beginning, that's not entirely surprising, but still, I thought that was interesting. And then the film was financed, this film was financed by two former investment bankers who themselves were later charged with embezzlement.
I didn't know that.
No, nor did I. But I mean, they settled out of court, so I should say charged. But yeah, it just seems to be absolutely rampant. And that last one I just thought was quite interesting. Residents of Trump Tower, whether that's real life or not, I don't know. But now I don't want to hog the proceedings, so these are what I thought were discussion points that we could potentially discuss. Don't need to tick them all off. Don't even need to tick any of them off. If there's something else in particular you wanted to raise, we can start with that. But I just thought I'd leave this up for a minute just to try and spark some ideas. In particular, I did one of these. Who were his actual marks? So scammers have marks, people they target. And actually, I thought what the film made a good show of was that actually his staff, for a large part, were Jordan Belfort's marks. It was them who he was persuading to go out and do the criminal enterprise sort of on his behalf. So like the flotation of the guy who made shoes, it was very important. He convinced his staff to go out and hard sell it, even though, they must have known that, they were overselling something, and, the people they were calling probably weren't going to make a great deal of money on this flotation, but he had to convince them. So, they, in a way, they as well were victims of this guy, or if at least they weren't victims, it was important that he was able to sell to them. And that made me instantly think when JB was talking about the real Jordan Belfort convincing all of these people that, they wanted to be like him. He was just doing the same thing he's always been doing. It's just convincing people that his life is enviable and that they should try and be rich and be like him and enjoy the success that he's had. But I think I've given you a chance to sort of take a quick look at these. So I've said my piece for now. Maybe over to anyone else if they've got any comments.
Gareth, that's great. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll end the sharing, but would you be able to maybe copy paste those notes and put them into the chat so we can just maybe use them as a kind of trigger a little bit later on.
That's a
Thank
great
you.
idea.
Thank you, Gareth. That really does set the scene so nicely. Let's go to JB. I reckon JB's got a few things to say about this movie. So, for you, JB, what are the key points you'd like to make before we go to others? Thank you, JB.
Yeah, I think it aptly describes the asset management industry, particularly in the 80s and into the 90s. In as much as I don't think anything that Jordan or Stratton did, they believed they were scamming. So in this term that we typically use in our industry, and it's usually quite easy to identify with, for example, pension scammers, right? Something that we're very versed with. They don't believe they're scamming, and it kind of goes to that dialogue in the restaurant that asset management and finance, it's a fugazi, it's a fugazi. Yes. It's fairy dust. It doesn't exist, and that's a great way for these traders to rationalize what they do, which is essentially to maximize profit and to extract capital from their customers. In their mind, they're not doing anything wrong, because the way that Wall Street and the industry was set up, it was that extreme right-wing version of capitalism. It was the Wall Street, which I know we've had on recently. And so in their mind, they weren't scamming customers. That's how they rationalize it to themselves. You know, it's not, in their mind, it's not they're not trying to defraud customers. And there's the true sadness. That is really what was the problem. It was seen as, well, this is how the market works. You know, some profit and some lose. And then in their head, that's how they rationalize. And I think that kind of goes to the core of that whole film, frankly.
And JB, did you think that whole model of hard sell, don't worry about the client, just think about hitting your figures and making your money, that whole model, I would suggest, seems to be dependent on recruiting a certain type of person? Would you go along with that? And what would you describe as the characteristics of that kind of person? I guess you were touching on this earlier when you were speaking about the people that went to go and see him give his lectures and so on up in Scotland. What are the characteristics, the sorts of people who are susceptible to or vulnerable to or appealing to people like Jordan Belfort?
Well, I think everyone knows, particularly in the 80s and 90s, it was young, hyper-aggressive males, young, dumb, and something I can't mention. And in London, if you make the analogy, it's no surprise that many of the first day traders were barrow boys. In fact, the barrow boys would be often referred to in the trading pits. And it's that same mentality. In New York, it was the Brooklyn boys, you know, that would bring that sense of hard sell. Jordan Belfort started off as a meat salesman. That's where he learned his trade, knocking on doors and selling meat on the doorstep to people. And he suddenly became the best meat salesperson, right, because he understood psychology and behavior. And that's the thing. It's not these people don't stumble into what they do. It's a craft. It's a very dark craft. It's how they understand how to nudge and manipulate people into a sales process. It's an extreme version of the sales filter. And that is still in some ways still the Bible he evangelizes today, telling people how to sell. He doesn't care. And then I think this is true in the film. He doesn't care what they were selling. It was the profit margin. It was the commission rate. They could have been selling anything. It could have been cars, it could have been planes, whatever actually delivered the commission rate. The impact on victims was collateral. It wasn't the purpose of what they did. And there's a distinction there to be made. Criminality was a byproduct of what they did. Right. It wasn't. They didn't seek out to be criminals. They sought out to be rich, and that's the difference. And that's what typifies. That certainly typified asset management back in the pre-regulation days. It probably typifies a fair old chunk of asset management today. I often say that many people wouldn't be in asset management and investment banking if it didn't pay the money that it did. And so that's what attracts. And in London and New York, it was the same thing. It attracted young males who were able to operate in high stress, highly combative type situations. And that's what suited them. So you attract that kind of people, and you unfortunately you attract a certain behaviors that come with it.
And do you think, JB, that the industry today still wants to attract that type of person?
That's a tough one. I'm going to give the industry the benefit of the doubt and say the answer is no, that it has changed. Does that still, are people still attracted into the industry on the promise that they can own a Ferrari, that they can have a super yacht, that they can, make millions? The answer is absolutely yes. Finance for me, and again, it came up in the film, there's no physicality to finance. So what is the motivation? Yes, in recent years, we can see many people have been attracted into, with a greater sense of social purpose, to deploy capital in a better way, to develop, perhaps a better world. But by and large, people enter finance because they think they can earn more money there than they can in being a doctor or being a lawyer or being something else. So I don't think it's as overt or as aggressive that it was in the 80s and 90s. Clearly, it's much more heavily regulated. But I think there's still something that attracts students, and I see this in universities towards finance, perhaps over other disciplines. So I'd like to say it's better and significantly better. But I think we're kidding ourselves. And, we could see that in the LIBOR trading, and we could see that through the great financial crisis and Bear Stearns. And, time and time again, we will come across people who will want to operate boiler rooms and that boiler room type scenario, who want to try and, frankly, carve out profit at everyone else's expense. And I think that there's something inherent in the nature of investment and an asset management that just draws that out of people.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, JB. Again, you've provided great input. Just before we go to Nigel for his thoughts, Gareth, is there anything that JB said that you'd like to sort of pick up on or reply to or speak to?
Yeah, I think it was interesting talking about the sorts of people that get drawn into it, because certainly the ones in this film, I think he says, give them to me hungry. These were not sort of Ivy League educated, polished people he had working for him. He had people who were, they had sort of a bit of sales nous, but it was more street smarts than intellect.
Yeah.
And actually, it occurred to me that in a lot of these films, I think in all of them, to be honest, we've watched Boiler Room, Wall Street, we're coming to, but I watched that recently, and this one. The firms that they focus on aren't the sort of establishment firms with those sort of Ivy League people working for them. They're sort of a bit rough and ready, and it makes me wonder is, do the establishment firms look down on these sorts of firms because they sort of cut a lot of corners and because they undertake these practices, and I know that? Or is it just that the establishment firms tend to be the ones that get away with it, and it's these other firms that don't have those connections, and they're startups and trying to muck in with the big boys, they're the ones who get punished ultimately because they're not establishment? So I mean I don't know the answer to that, and I suppose you probably can't know the answer to that, but I've certainly got my suspicions. But yeah, that's what that got me thinking of.
Thanks, Gareth. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Nigel Cairns, your thoughts, please.
Well, reflecting on what JB had to say a few moments ago, which is really interesting, my take on the situation is that from the 80s until now, the situation has changed. It's evolved in terms of the methods of exploitation of people to part them with their cash. There's been the skill sets have changed, and I think these days it's less sort of brutal, more subtle perhaps, but the skill sets are more attuned to subverting regulation and finding ways through the gaps and basically any way that succeeds to circumnavigate the legislation and or the political will of maybe the current government or any government to do anything about the harms that are caused.
Yeah.
So I think, if anything, the situation is worse, and I think the industry is as culpable or more culpable, because I think they've just become better at what they're doing and seem to have become more immune to attack, because it's a much slicker operation these days than it was in the 80s. Another facet that I'd just like to comment on is that I think in the 80s, the general culture situation in the States was perhaps more distinctly different to the UK culture, in that in the States, respect came from being wealthy. If you were wealthy and successful, you'd made it. You didn't have to have any other sort of titles of nobility or awards. You were king just because you were successful. And I think that in itself would sort of perhaps put fuel on the fire for the type of exploitation that went on in The Wolf of Wall Street. But I think the basics are still the same. I think it's just the model has developed.
What you've just touched on there is a really interesting, because it is a definite recurring theme. It seems there are some people out there, perhaps lots of people out there, who only seem to measure their own self-worth by how much money they're making. It's as if there's no other kind of qualitative dimension to it at all. And maybe folks like us are a bit naive that is the way for a lot of people.
Sorry, Andy, I don't think we should be surprised by this. It's a basic human instinct, basically, to survive and do the best you can, or for your close family, to the expense of others outside of your immediate group. I think the idea that we're all naturally born to be just as caring in the wider community, or even globally for that matter, is a bit of a myth, really, because clearly all of us that live in Western society are just as guilty in many ways of the people in the film that we're seeing now, from enjoying our lifestyle at the expense of a third world. And perhaps that's been we've had cause to reflect on that a bit more this week with Glasgow going on. But I don't see any fundamental difference. We're enjoying, not through personal fault, but we have to recognise that because of our heritage, in the case of the UK, for instance, from empire, it was on the back of heinous deeds in many cases that we still currently enjoy a very good standard of living.
Wow, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. I noticed JB popped his hand up. We'll go to JB in just a moment. What you're saying, Nigel, if I get this right, is you're saying that in actual fact, most people are, to a different degree and a different way, fundamentally guilty of the same thing, i.e. putting our own interests ahead of others, and therefore causing harm to others and the planet in an attempt to make progress and get more money in the bank and do the other things that we want to do.
Yes, I am saying that, Andy, and I think that is the default situation. And I think it's a grave error to think that it's anything else, because we're not going to solve the problem until we confront the fact that we're perhaps a little bit more primitive at heart than we like to give ourselves credit for.
Wow. Which to my mind takes the conversation to how the sector should be regulated, but we'll come on to that in a minute. JB, let's jump back to JB, then we'll go to Jenny.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Do you know, I just got thinking as we were listening to some of Nigel's thoughts there, and literally a penny dropped, no pun intended. The penny dropped in as much as we regulated the industry really from sort of 86 onwards, and we've been progressively trying to do that for the last 20 or so years. And, things like penny stock trading and the way traders are allowed to access, all that has become very curtailed and heavily regulated. But then I realized something very obvious. The penny stock behavior has just evolved. It's moved on. And where it exists now is on Reddit forums and investment letters and in social media and in Robinhood platforms. The same behaviors are being replicated now around speculative crypto stocks, non-fungible tokens. We're just seeing a repeat. Think of GameStop, which was lauded as a great democratization for the little investor. And of course, that's what the whole penny stock trading was. It was about garbage men and, just basic, average people effectively being conned. And, we saw that behavior at GameStop. We saw what was happening. But we also then heard later report that the same investment banks and hedge fund managers were manipulating the market and the prices to their profit. And so I think we're just seeing a repeat. We might change the market through regulation, but we don't change the inherent behavior. I think that's the problem for me.
Yeah. Can I just chip in there? It seems very obvious that the behavior is always slightly ahead of the regulation. The regulation is always playing catch up because it's trying to adapt to the latest scam or disaster that's just been exposed in the news. And we'll never be ahead of the game. I don't know what JB thinks about that, but that would be my thought.
I wouldn't disagree with you, Nigel. I think that's always going to be the problem. Regulation will always trail behavior and activities, and that's why we also need to look towards litigation and violation tracker and transparency and everything else, frankly, because we know that regulators are always going to be slow to the party.
That's because the market doesn't think ahead. The market regulators react to what's happening in the outward. So think about even with the cladding situation, now there is a problem in the market. The government will need to react to that, probably bringing on more regulations. But this is exactly touching base on the points you have raised. This is exactly that, because obviously the governments, both in the US and also in the UK and Europe, are bringing on more regulations in terms of compliance, both legal and financial compliance, like increasing corporate governance, which touched base upon more disclosures and all that. But exactly as JB said, it doesn't matter how much you increase regulations. Look at cryptocurrencies or any form of virtual world that at the moment is just not regulated. They are just bringing the same, let's say, model just into new environments, which they are going to just operate in the same way. So, and that's also led by consumerism. So people don't really think about making money. I mean, making money shouldn't be the aim. Learning skills and spending time on how to become better professionals, for example, that should be the aim. But people are just thinking, oh, how can I make money investing? Look at, for example, just something very simple. I don't know how many of you use Facebook, but the increased amount of adverts on publicity on people who invest in cryptocurrencies or shares, and they say they make money very easily. This is just the concept that's just streamlined, really. That's really my thought.
Gareth's got his hand up.
Yeah, I just thought I'd make a one point in case anyone sort of felt dejected, like criminals are always going to find a way around regulation. I think there is a degree which is a bit like, the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. You take a step forward and they take a further step and you're constantly chasing. But there aren't infinite ways for criminals to adapt. And the example that occurred to me is bank robbery, because bank robbery is, as I understand it, I'm not an expert in this area, but it's all but extinct by this point, because it's just very, very next to impossible to get away with. No one ever gets away with it. It's only sort of really desperate people that attempt it now, and they tend to get caught. That's my understanding of the situation. And I think probably to a large degree that's the case because that's rich people being stolen from. But that is just an example to show that, you know, in case anyone thought, well, you know, is there any point to regulation? You know, should we keep pressing for regulation if criminals are just going to adapt? Eventually, you will catch up. And, you know, we have to hope that eventually with something like pension scams, just for an example, that you can close enough loopholes that it no longer becomes a viable source of revenue for criminals, and they have to resort to other things. And hopefully, eventually, one day, maybe there will be no other avenues they can pursue where you can earn any money immorally. But you just have to keep plugging away.
Well, that's a really, really nice line of thought. It really is a nice line of thought. I want to come at this from the perspective of our approach to regulation, because one of the things I got from the film was how determined the regulators were, you know, the FBI and the SEC, to kind of close this down. You know, they approached the situation seriously. They got stuck in, they investigated, they did all kinds of good detective work to actually trap these guys and get them prosecuted, etc. And genuinely, earlier today, I was speaking to a journalist who has good experience and good understanding of how things are done in the US. And this particular person was saying to me that if you contrast the SEC's approach and the FCA's approach, there's a huge difference between the two. You know, the SEC would, for example, the way the regulations work in America, as I understand it, they pay whistleblowers, they incentivize whistleblowing. If somebody's committing fraud, they put a lot of resource into it, they chase it down, they prosecute, they enforce. Whereas, as everybody on this call probably knows, in the last few years, it's almost become an accepted given that the Financial Conduct Authority seems to be quite slow to react and slow to respond for reasons I don't really understand. I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say that the regulatory approach in the UK seems to be soft and quite timid and slow and reactive. And those are not the characteristics I would associate with the way that the SEC works, based upon what I understand from what I hear here, there, and everywhere, but also what came across in that film. Any comments about that particular point, the kind of contrast between the different sides of the Atlantic? Yes, Nigel?
Yeah, well, I think you're being very kind to the FCA in the way that you characterise them as being very slow. I think the truth of the matter, and I think a lot of people would agree with me on this, is that they are actively and have been actively defending undefendable situations with financial firms against the interests of many consumers. And I think the primary reason for this is the remit that they have as their overriding principle under FSMA being the well-working of the financial markets. And the interest of the consumer, I think, by default, has always become secondary. And I think that's so entrenched that the FCA personnel, with the possible exception of the new CEO, because I do think he is trying very hard to address matters. I hope I'm right in saying that that's the case. But I do recognise he's got a massive task to turn the whole thing around. But I think that the mindset is so endemic with the FCA in protecting firms that they've just got no basis or idea of how to turn the ship around or to change direction.
Thanks, Nigel. Any other comments about this particular aspect of it, the regulatory dimension?
Well, one other thing that I wanted to add slightly to what was going on earlier about the regulatory environment, I think the emphasis has to be more and more on personal responsibility and away from the the fact that firms are fined, as we all know, time and time again, and they're happy to pay the fines. There should be personal jeopardy for people in consciously making decisions that they know are going to cause harm. And this is clearly something that Mr. Bailey was very, very keen not to be personally identified with, where Dame Gloucester was thankfully at pains to recognise that really wasn't the the correct situation, either legally or morally. And a lot of people have jumped on that now, and I think there is a little bit of momentum in recognising that personal responsibility has to figure much larger than it has done historically. Otherwise, we're sunk.
I think you're bang on there. I think that we've heard on these events before that people have explained that the primary regulatory response to the many governance failures that led to the global financial crisis was the SMCR regime, so Senior Manager Certification regime, which was an attempt, as I understand it, to make individuals accountable. The idea basically being that if individuals are accountable, they're far, far less likely to allow bad stuff to carry on and to do bad things. But as most of us know, the actual number of times that the Senior Manager Certification regime has been used is very, very low. And it does make you wonder, why is there this apparent reluctance to not go hard on baddies? Especially when I would imagine every time a regulator was tough on a culprit, not only do they catch the culprit, but it sends out a really strong deterrent signal. And at the moment, we just don't seem to have that at all. This goes back to what Gareth was saying about pension scams. At the moment, being a pension scammer is a very low risk, highly paid, secure line of work for immorally minded people. JB.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, it's just a quick thought on SMCR. As someone who is a board director of an asset management firm, a non-exec, I am covered by SMCR.
Right.
The problem with SMCR is, whilst it's being accepted by the industry, what happens is firms put a price on that accountability. And what I mean by that is they just increase their professional indemnity insurance cover, to make sure that all the directors and officers are sufficiently covered if there's a claim against them. The problem with that is it then creates a degree of apathy, I think, in boards and firms, that whilst they might be directly accountable and it might even be brought to court, there's a nice bit of insurance sitting there that's going to pay for lots of legal fees to effectively cover them. We've seen time and time again, to your earlier points about FCA versus SEC, this is not a regulator that really imprisons people. They just don't do it. It's such a occurrence. The FCA have shown that they are inept, certainly incompetent when it comes to bringing court case. And that's why I think we're starting to see the growth of a litigious system in the UK, much akin to the US. And I say this as an expert witness, and I'm currently involved in a number of high-profile cases where essentially plaintiffs have just circumnavigated the FCA and the FOSS altogether and are going to pursue firms through the courts. And I think this is a growing trend we're going to see. And I think it reflects just that general impression of the FCA not being capable when it comes to enforcement.
I understood, if I can just interject briefly, because I may be wrong on this point, but I'd understood from fairly early on that SMCR was a dead duck because law firms, magic circle firms, had found ways for firms, financial firms, to contract out of SMCR so that the relevant manager effectively could be an appointed person or somebody in a law firm that was acting as proxy for that particular firm, and therefore couldn't be prosecuted perhaps in the same way as an internal management person of that firm. I think the fact that I don't think there's ever been a successful case, maybe one or two under SMCR, it must mean that it's universally regarded as a complete and utter failure.
Mm.
I don't know if JB, would say that there are that is partly the correct reasoning why SMCA
I'm not sure
didn't succeed in the first place.
It's a fair question. I'm undecided whether SMCR is an abject failure. I think the failing is in the FCA's enforcement of it. Certainly key roles within asset management firms, CF1, which would be the chief executive, for example, the CF10, financial officer, these things can't be delegated out of the board. They have to be board members of the company. Legal counsel can certainly be contracted out of the firm, but there's still the levers to go after a firm. The problem is the FCA just don't seem to show the ability. So there's that inability to enforce. And I think the other thing is just how much financial activity occurs within the UK today that's not even within the jurisdiction of the FCA and just falls through the cracks. And obviously the mini bond scandal was one really good example of that. Crypto is another. There's so many finance that just aren't regulated. And indeed, penny stocks is the great example here for Wolf of Wall Street. Penny stock activity was an unregulated activity back in the day. And all we're seeing is just new variations of it.
I would agree with that, but the only thing I would say is I don't think it's a lack of ability. I think it's more to do with a lack of will or direction of travel that's causing the inability.
I'd agree with that as well, Nigel. And something that keeps coming up time and time again, my good friend Jerome Tagger over at Preventable Surprises runs a project called CLAP, which I don't think translates particularly well over to across the Atlantic. It's an American project. I haven't pointed this out, but it's about corporate policy capture, which I think is a fascinating area. It's something I'm personally quite interested in, and this is really how companies lobby and manipulate and influence their regulators to essentially dilute and step back and not do the things, I guess, as consumers we would actually want to see the regulators do. And I think there is something in that. There is no doubt that being in Canary Wharf, next to 1CP, next to the investment banks, I know they've moved now, but I think there was just something that became quite incestuous. And the SEC went through a similar phase of this, actually, 3 or so decades ago. And more recently, there's certainly been a few accusations towards the SEC as well. That's the problem. When they're all inside the same village, they sometimes can't make the distinction. And that's what the FCA has to do. And I think it's fair to say has failed to do.
I'm currently a victim of exactly what you've described, JB. So I agree with you absolutely on that point.
Yeah, this point around the revolving door comes up time and time again. The confusion and potential conflicts of interest caused by loyalties to previous employers, potential future employers, so on and so forth.
My thoughts are, I don't know why, if I was like a senior manager or working for a law firm, I will never put my license at stake and offer my name to go instead of the one of somebody else's. I don't know. My first comment would be like, probably in the UK there are less. It's also different in the market. The FCA perhaps has got less interest in pursuing this kind of financial, let's say, to regulate less or pursue less, because also if you look at the UK market, perhaps the financial services has got a huge stake compared to the US. So, and it's a particularly difficult time, this one, to settle. So I think that could be a point. In terms of regulations, I can say that I've seen banks are increasing their due diligence. I've seen banks refusing bank accounts, for example, to companies if they didn't like where high risk jurisdictions We trade, for example, in particular in Africa, and we were turned down. But I've seen increasing regulation, so on some levels. So I don't know, perhaps what JB was saying, that maybe undercover there are agreements, but I can't comment on that.
We're going to pass back to Gareth in a short while just to kind of sum up and share his sort of final thoughts on the session. Before we go to Gareth, I'm going to invite everybody else to provide a final comment if they would like to. And before we do that, I just want to share my screen to show you one thing that the TTF's doing that you may not be aware of. What you're looking at, folks, is our Global Financial Services Oath group. This is very much a work in progress. The idea basically is this: we're far, far less likely to have problems if the people inside the industry are ethical and professional. It's kind of as simple as that, yeah? It's as simple as that. So on that basis, why not have some kind of oath that the industry sort of signs up to? So here's our kind of working draft. It really is only a draft. What we're thinking is, as a financial services professional, I hereby commit by way of this this professional oath that, I'll start again. As a financial services professional, I hereby commit by way of this solemn professional oath that I shall always act in an ethical, transparent, and trustworthy manner, and I shall accept the consequences if I do not. I recognize that my own conduct influences the behavior of others, and I know it's my professional duty to expose any wrongdoing that I encounter. And different parts of the world are using oaths in different ways. So there's one in Australia, for example, called the banking oath. There's one in Holland being used by the banking sector. I personally like the idea that one day there'll be some kind of global financial services oath that people commit to, with real consequences if they breach it. You know, you're banned from the industry for life kind of thing, or you're banned for 10 years, where the trade bodies and the professional associations properly enforce it. I think it might help, particularly in relation to the recruitment of the people coming into the industry. Yeah, the people who cause the harm are bad apples. And if we can do something to reduce the number of bad apples getting into the industry in the first place, then that's a good thing. There's a recruitment agency in Boston who does work for top level financial services firms. And one of the metrics it has when it's recruiting senior execs is moral quotient. So everybody knows about intellectual quotient. Everyone's heard about emotional quotient. There's also another dimension, which is moral quotient. And what they've worked out is that if you're going to appoint the chief executive chairman of an organization with a low moral quotient, then the chance of that company ending up getting into trouble is much, much higher than if you've got a senior leadership team with high moral quotient, because the culture from the top trickles down. And if you've got good people at the top, you'll have good people all the way through it. So I find that really, really interesting. If you were to apply the moral quotient idea to the characters in The Wolf of Wall Street, none of them would have got past it. You know, none of them would have got past it. They would literally not have been allowed to get in the industry. And that's, I think, where we're going wrong. I think our industry is not tough enough on the barriers to entry, and not tough enough on enabling people to carry on trading if they have been doing dodgy thing. I think it was Nigel made the point earlier. We regulate firms, not individuals. It's far, far easy for individuals to do dodgy stuff and then phoenix into another firm. Lots to think about there, all brought on by this movie. Gareth, we'll get to you in a second. Just to Nigel, then to JB and anyone else who wants to say something before we go to Gareth. Nigel, any final thoughts from yourself, please?
I don't know that people are just much more likely to commit crime, or I think what I'm trying to say is that shareholders buying shares will buy the share irrespective, 99.9% time out of 100 of the moral makeup of the CEO. It's the company's performance that are going to determine which shares they buy and what return they think they can get on those shares. And I think that is the dominant moving force. And I think that has to be taken into account in any regulatory framework.
It does,
really.
Because they have changed the corporate governance, and they are adding a more and more duty to disclose towards shareholders in lieu of actually of what happened throughout the years, starting off with the Lehman Brothers collapse, as well as other less famous collapses. So there is already legislation in place to move forward against more disclosure towards, obviously for public company is mandatory, for private limited company is less mandatory. This is not only in the UK, by the way, it's also in the US. So that's already, but my view is also, there is always way for money. It's not only the financial sector. Look at the real estate sector. It's widely used to money laundering capitals from the finance world. So it's a circle. It's not just limited to an industry. So I think the problem is wider than we think. So I think what you're saying is, Andy, is quite good in terms of probably having an oath and making people bound by it rather than corporations. Corporation can easily go bankrupt and disappear. But yeah, it's gonna be tough for that to be introduced, in my opinion.
Yeah,
because it's gonna be a game changer, isn't it?
I agree. I agree with you. Thank you, Nigel, for your final thoughts and for yours. Let's go to JB's, then we'll jump to Gareth, I think. JB.
Thanks, Andy. I guess parting thoughts. Reminded of when Daniel Godfrey tried to instill a customer pledge, essentially, IA, and lost his job. I think that tells us much about the industry and that. And I'll finish with a final note of whether we can be better, whether we can be good as an industry. Nietzsche will remind us that good is simply the herding instinct of the individual. And it's all about that herding instinct and instilling good culture.
Thanks, JB. Wise words. And yes, you're a very good reminder about what happened to Daniel Godfrey. Crikey, it seems like a lifetime ago now, doesn't it? Yes. Thank you, JB. Lovely. To Gareth for your final comments, please.
A couple of final thoughts. One, sort of going back a few steps, talking about the difference between the SEC, how it seemed to be very motivated and on point and quite strict in comparison to the FCA. I wondered if a difference might be that SEC is Securities and Exchange Commission, has a very narrow remit, and you compare that to the FCA, which has an absolutely huge remit. And I think there is a difficult balance, because when you have the FCA and a pensions regulator, my industry again, there is the problem where those jurisdictions overlap and maybe things can fall through the gaps. And so there's no perfect way to regulate, but that's just what it made me think about. And it's maybe something to, take away and think about more. But as a sort of a summing up point, one thing we didn't really get to, but it's quite interesting it didn't come up, is that the major criticism of Wolf of Wall Street was that it didn't seem to condemn the behavior of the protagonists. It sort of just put it up there, and in a way it almost felt like it was glamorizing it, if anything.
Fair point.
And I think what Scorsese would say is that I shouldn't have to have violin music to tell you that this is abhorrent behavior. It should be obvious to you that it's both seductive and terrible at the same time. And as I say, I think it's kind of natural. I think everyone here would get that, because we're the sorts of people who are drawn to the TTF. But it did make me think, these people who went to the same seminar as JB and are thinking, isn't this great? I want to live this life. That maybe they needed that kind of prod to remind you that, actually there's victims. This is terrible. You're not supposed to be clapping along with Jordan Belfort. But yeah, that's my final thoughts.
That's a great set of thoughts to bring the session to a close. I think it is fascinating, isn't it, that the man who that film's all about is still out there, basically doing the same thing, recruiting people to think in a particular way, or perhaps more fairly to him, attracting people who already think in a particular way and getting them to spend their money on his expertise to be able to think that way more effectively. Wow, 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 wow. The story's going to roll on, isn't it? Can we please show our appreciation to Gareth for preparing the session and getting all the slides done? Gareth, well done as always. Really, really enjoyable conversation, everybody. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
Really
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
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 Have a good evening
Night.
and good night.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
guys.
Bye-bye.